Stick around because today we're going to discuss lore and how you can use it to enhance your stories. What's up, guys? My name's Brandon McNulty. I'm a writer, I'm the author of Bad Parts, and welcome to my writing channel. Today we're going to be discussing lore, and lore is something that can confuse some writers, and I think a lot of the problems come from the fact that some people think that lore and world building are the exact same thing. And for the purpose of today's video, I'm going to separate the two, and I'm actually going to say that lore is a part of world building. So they are definitely connected, there's some overlap, but lore is its own thing. And what lore is the histories, the traditions, the facts, and the stories that are passed down within your story world. I think one of the best ways to illustrate this is by having you picture yourself at a sporting event. It could be a football game, basketball game, whatever. Picture yourself sitting in the stands and watching the players on the field, the coaches on the sidelines, and the game is going on. People are trying to score points and win the game. The players in this example and the coaches, they would be the characters. And the actual game, the back and forth, everything that leads up to the conclusion, that would be the plot. Now, the lore, on the other hand, would be things that you might hear in the stands from other fans. You might hear a fan next to you mentioning that the last time these two teams played, the one team got ripped off and the refs had rigged the game and now the other team deserves to win. That would be an example of lore. That's a little piece of history. You might also hear somebody behind you talking about how this rivalry has been really heated ever since the late 90s, ever since one team knocked the other out of the playoffs and the two teams have hated each other ever since. Again, this is a piece of lore. And all these different little nuggets of the history of the rivalry and the teams, they make the game that you're watching seem like it's bigger than it actually is. It's not just a bunch of people running back and forth on the field trying to score points. It's something that's part of a larger idea. And that's what lore should accomplish in your stories. It should make your world feel vivid, authentic, and meaningful. And it should convince your audience that your story world exists before and after your main plot, as well as outside of it. We should be convinced that there are other people in this world that we haven't met, that live lives and have hopes and dreams, and they go to work and they come home, and there should be all kinds of things going on outside of what we see on the screen or on the page. That is what lore should be contributing to. Now, a great example of lore's effectiveness in a movie would come from the original Star Wars movie, when Luke sits down with Obi-Wan for the first time. And there are a lot of different nuggets that are dropped here, a lot of lore that comes in the form of mentioning the Clone Wars and the Empire and lightsabers and Jedi Knights and the history of Luke's father and how he was betrayed by Darth Vader. All these little pieces of lore help build a story world that is much larger than the movie that we're simply watching over the course of 2 hours. These pieces of lore help make this movie become something much more than just a story about a group of people who are trying to blow up a space station. And that's part of the reason why Star Wars was so successful, because the lore enhanced our understanding of the characters and the plot and the setting and the themes and everything else going on in the story. Now, before you actually get into writing lore in your stories, it's important to keep in mind audience expectations. And different genres will have different audience expectations. For instance, if you're writing a fantasy story or a sci-fi story, those audiences will typically be pretty receptive to lore. They like to learn more about the story world and how it came to be and the history and so on and so on. However, if you're writing a contemporary thriller or contemporary romance, typically these audiences are more engaged in the characters and or the plot. So you might want to tap the brakes on the lore if you're starting to pump a lot into it. Now, as far as actually writing lore in your stories, I think the important thing to remember is that you need to find the things that interest you the most about your story world and then build from there. If you followed my videos recently, you know that I did a video on building a story from an idea web. You find your main idea and then you find other ideas that connect to it. And that's how you build a story. And I think the same principle applies to building the lore within your story. You find some critical, important ideas, the ones that excite you the most, and then you build out from there. For instance, if you were writing the lore for The Walking Dead, you might start with the idea of the zombie outbreak and what is the history of that? How did that come about? And then how did it affect different groups of people? And how did different groups respond? And how did people come to learn about how the virus affects them? And how does that affect the timeline of everything? Things like that. And of course, if you watch The Walking Dead, you know that they sprinkle in lore pretty much every time we get a new character on the show or in the comics. We usually have the main cast of characters, and then they'll encounter somebody new, and that new person will almost always come with a backstory of they were in some town where everybody went crazy because they all panicked or something like that, and now they're just trying to survive on their own. All these different histories, even though we don't actually get to see them, they contribute to our understanding of the story world, and they make The Walking Dead feel larger than it actually is. Now, when you're trying to build the lore in your story world, you might ask yourself some questions like, how did this world come to be? What were the major events or people that shaped it and brought us to this point? You might also ask, what do people do in their daily lives? How does everyone contribute to this world? What do they do in order to get by? And what kind of conflicts are there in daily life? You might ask yourself the question, who is in power? How did they obtain power? Were they ever opposed? And then you might also ask, what kind of magic spells, items, or creatures exist in this world? How did they come into existence? If you're writing a contemporary horror story that involves a monster or a haunted house, you might not need to explain too much about the world since it's contemporary, but we do want to get some clues into the history of the monster or the history of the haunted house. How did it get haunted? When did it get haunted? Things like that. Now, before I wrap up this video, I want to give you two final pieces of advice. And the first one of these is that your lore should always support and enhance your characters, your plot, or your themes. If you're just doing lore for the sake of lore, you're eventually going to be heading down the wrong path. So try to keep focused. And then the second piece of advice is that there's no correct way to go about writing lore. Some people argue that you should write all your lore before you start writing your actual story. Other people say that you should just write your actual story and include lore as you go along. Whatever works for you, just roll with it. Don't worry about what other people are saying. Whatever you find interesting, grab onto that and chase it throughout the history of your story world and figure out how you can use that to enhance your stories. So I hope this helps. Question of the day, what is your favorite movie and what is the most interesting piece of lore from that movie? Let us know in the comments section below. Thank you guys for watching. If you want to support the channel, please pick up a copy of Bad Parts if you haven't already. Also, be sure to check out my other videos. Hit the like and subscribe buttons for me, share this video with a friend, and as always, remember to keep on writing.